Welcome back. I know it's hard to believe, but we are already on to Unit 4. So Unit 4 is all about transport, specifically transport of molecules across the cell membrane. All right, so the very first thing that we need to do is go over our aim. And today's aim is how does the structure of the cell membrane help its function? So hopefully you know what the function of the cell membrane is, if you think back to our Unit 2. But today we're going to figure out how its structure helps it do that. Right, so the very first thing I want you to do is pause this video, answer your 2 do now questions, and then press play when you're ready to go over them together. All right, so question number 1 was, what is the function of the cell membrane? So you should have said something about the fact the cell membrane controls what goes in and out of the cell. And I wrote this word plasma membrane down as well because we need to remember that these 2 words are interchangeable. Sometimes you're going to see cell membrane, sometimes you're going to see plasma membrane, but those 2 words mean the exact same thing. Okay, so our cell membrane is kind of like the door of the cell. It controls what goes in and out. All right, number 2 said damage to which structure will most directly disrupt water balance within a single-celled organism. So you should hopefully know that most of the cell is made up of water. Remember, the cytoplasm is mostly water. Okay, so I kind of think of the cell as like a water balloon. So it holds that cell intact with all of those watery structures inside. But if we poke a hole in that cell membrane, all of that water is going to explode. It's all going to come rushing out. Okay, so damage to the cell membrane, answer choice B, would directly disrupt that water balance because without the cell membrane, there is no cell. All right. So the first thing we're going to do today is read through a passage and answer some questions. So I'm going to read through this on my screen. And as I do that, I want you to answer questions 1 and 2. All right. One way that a cell maintains homeostasis, I'm going to pause us, because we should always remember that homeostasis means a stable internal environment. All right, so one way that a cell maintains homeostasis is by controlling the movement of substances across the cell membrane. The cell membrane performs 2 primary functions. It separates the cell from its environment, providing protection and support, as well as enables communication and movement of materials between the cell and its environment. Without that cell membrane, there would be no cell. The composition of nearly all cell membranes is a double-layered sheet called the lipid bilayer. There are 2 layers. These are 2 layers of lipids, hence the name bilayer. I can't read today. The lipid bilayer gives cell membranes a flexible structure that forms a strong barrier between the cell and its surroundings. Right, so question 1 was, what are the cell membrane's 2 primary functions? So you should have picked out from this passage that the 2 functions are to separate the cell from the environment, providing protection and support, and to enable communication and movement of materials between the cell and its environment. Okay, so we know this. The cell membrane gives that cell its structure. It separates the cell from everything that's outside. And then we're also going to be talking about this second function more frequently in the upcoming weeks, that it enables communication and movement of materials between the cell and its environment. So it lets things go in and out. Right, number 2, what is a lipid bilayer and what is its function? So whenever you see the prefix bi, that's going to be talking about 2. So because we're working with a lipid bilayer here, that means that we're going to be working with, why isn't it going up? There it is. This means that it is 2 layers of lipids. So because it's a bilayer, there are 2 layers. This is what gives the cell membrane a flexible structure that forms a strong barrier between the cell and its surroundings. And hopefully you remember that the word lipid is just talking about fats. So it's actually made up of 2 layers of fats. All right. So as soon as you have written those down, let's move on. The next thing on your notes is a picture of what the cell membrane is made up of. So there are 4 different components that we need to go over today. The very first component that I want you to note is the phospholipid itself. So this is what the bilayer is made up of. And you should write the definition that's pictured right here. So phospholipids are special lipids made up of a phosphate head and 2 fatty acid tails. So the phospholipid ends up looking something like this, where we have this phosphate head and 2 fatty acid tails. Okay. Now we also need to note that this head up here is polar and is attracted to water. If something is attracted to water, we're going to call it hydrophilic. So I'm going to draw some water molecules up here. There's some water droplets because our phosphate head loves water. Okay. But our tail is nonpolar and is repelled by water. So if something is repelled by water, we're going to call it hydrophobic. It's almost afraid of water. Okay, so because these 2 fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, that means they're going to push away all of that water molecules. They don't want anything to do with water. Right, so the entire phospholipid bilayer, the entire cell membrane, is made up of stacks of these guys, of these phospholipids. The next component that you need to know is something called a carbohydrate, which we've heard of before. But carbohydrates here are going to look like almost antennas on the surface of the cell. So these green molecules right here, kind of like antennas that stick up. So these chains stick out from the surface of the membrane and act as identifying markers on cells. And these are also going to act as receptor sites for bonding. So these carbohydrates or these antennas are almost like tags that are put on the surface of the cell so that other cells can recognize one another. Like they'll see that antenna, they'll see that carbohydrate from across the way and be like, oh, he's one of my friends, I can go over there. So these are what allow cells to recognize each other. Right, the next thing we need to know is a protein channel. That is going to be this large structure here in the middle of the cell. Now, the reason it reaches all the way across the bilayer, the double membrane, is because this channel is going to act almost like a tunnel. And it's going to allow molecules to go in or out of the cell. So when we talk about the protein channel, I like to think of it as like a tunnel that different molecules can go through. Right, so these protein channels are found in the plasma membrane, and they allow necessary substances or waste material to move in and out of the cell. Right, and the final component that we need to know is something called cholesterol. Now, you may have heard of cholesterol before, and we usually hear of it as a bad thing, right? You don't want to have high cholesterol. But in terms of your cell membrane, cholesterol is actually a really good thing. So cholesterol is going to be these little brown structures that are found scattered throughout the membrane. And what cholesterol does is it actually prevents the plasma membrane's fatty acid chains from either sticking together or from moving too far apart. So what ends up happening is this bilayer is actually pretty susceptible to temperature change. And when it's cold, those phospholipid tails or those fatty acid tails are going to stick together super tightly. And when it's more hot, they're going to spread out and move farther apart from one another. And the cholesterol prevents either of those things from damaging the cell. So the cholesterol is going to hold on to those I cannot speak. The cholesterol is going to hold on to those fatty acid chains and prevent those tails from either moving too far apart or from sticking too close together. Right. So as soon as you have written down all of those definitions, we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, so here is another view of what those phospholipid or phosphate groups look like. Okay, so your bilayer is made up of these phosphate heads and fatty acid tails. Now I know this is a little bit difficult to view, so I'm trying to color code it here to make it make more sense. So what I've circled in blue is your phosphate head. And what I've circled in red are those 2 fatty acid tails. Okay, and they're going to stack on top of each other to form that entire cell membrane. So our phosphate heads, again, are what we call hydrophilic. If we break down that word, the word hydro is talking about water. And whenever you see the suffix philic, that means loving. Okay. So water loving means that these, I just completely lost my trail of thought. Guys, it is Friday afternoon and you're watching me disintegrate live on television. All right, so these phosphate heads are hydrophilic, meaning they love to be around water. And that works out well for them because this aqueous environment, whenever you see the word aqueous, this just means watery. So these phosphate heads are actually swimming in water. They're having the time of their life. They love to be around water. Great, so I'm going to draw some hearts and some water molecules because they are loving this aqueous environment. But whenever we see the word hydrophobic, if we break that word down, hydro again means water. But this time phobic, the word phobic actually means fearing. So hydrophobic means that these tails hate water. They want nothing to do with it. They're actually afraid of water. They're so afraid of it that they turn their bodies physically around so they don't touch this water at all. So whenever this section that I've drawn in red doesn't want anything to do with water, they hate it. Okay, so this phospholipid bilayer works well together. And the reason we have to have 2 layers of it is so that these hydrophobic tails never touch water. These hydrophilic heads are going to be the ones that touch water on both the inside and outside of the cell. So once again, we see this word aqueous environment. That means that it is a watery environment. So these hydrophobic heads, again, are going to be swimming in this water. Right now, this next picture might make this look a little bit more sense. So I know right now you're probably thinking, I don't get it. How is this the membrane? But hopefully this next page will show you what it looks like. So this is what our cell membrane actually looks like. When we put those 2 layers together, they end up forming this complete circle. So this would be the inside of the cell, and this would be the outside of the cell. So again, both the inside and the outside of the cell are going to be aqueous environments, which means they are watery. We know that the inside of the cell is watery, but that outside is going to be as well. So both of those environments are going to be aqueous or watery, which means that those hydrophilic heads are having the time of their life. But the reason we have to have 2 of those layers is because these hydrophobic tails in the center can't ever touch water. Right? So what ends up happening is these polar heads are hydrophilic, which means that they are water loving. Those non-polar tails are hydrophobic, which means they are water fearing. And those 2 qualities are going to work together. And this is what makes the membrane selective for what crosses. So we've talked about how the cell membrane lets certain things cross and doesn't let other things cross. And that's because of these 2 hydrophobic and hydrophilic features working together to create that selective boundary. Right. So the very last thing I'm going to go over today is something called the fluid mosaic model. Now, this is a way to describe the cell membrane, and we call it the fluid mosaic model because the membrane is fluid. Those individual phospholipids and proteins can move around freely within the layer like it's a liquid. So this membrane is pretty flexible. Those different components are free to move around inside the membrane. And we call it a mosaic because the membrane itself is made up of so many different components. Today I told you about those protein channels. I told you about cholesterol. I told you about the phospholipids themselves. So there are a bunch of different components that make up this cell membrane. So we call it a mosaic because of the pattern produced by the scattered protein molecules when the membrane is viewed from above. So if we were to look at this from above, it might resemble something like these mosaics right here, where all of these different components work together and come together to form this beautiful picture, this beautiful work of art, if you will. All right, now that is all I have for you today. So as always, at the end of your worksheet, there is a link to an exit ticket. Go ahead and click on that, and there are 2 questions waiting for you. If you have any questions, send me a message on Remind and I will get back to you. But other than that, have a wonderful day.